So, good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to what I think will be a very interesting conversation that comes right at the time when COP27 is happening at some distance from here, but the themes that our guest today brings to us are very much related to climate change, to discussions about labor, ecology, and the recent and maybe still going on COVID-19 pandemic. And he's going to bring them all together in a very interesting way that, although it's about southern Brazil, I think it speaks to the wider region, Latin America, Caribbean, but also the globe. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jean Segata. He's a professor in the program of social anthropology at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. He also works in the graduate program in public policy there. He has a degree in psychology with a master's and doctorate in social anthropology from UFSC, which is Federal University of Santa Catarina. Yes. And he's done postdoctorals at the Federal University of Santa Catarina and at the National Center of Diagnostics and Investigation in endemic epidemics for the Ministry of Health in Argentina. And of course, he's been here as a postdoc at Brown University. Most recently, he was Craig M. Kogut Visiting Professor for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Brown University. His interests include in ethnography with digital technologies and human-animal relationships. He is the leader of something called, very fascinating, GEMMTE, which in English comes out to be the Multi-Species Microbiopolitics and Technosociality Studies Group, and is coordinator of a nucleus for animal studies, environment, and technology at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. So I think you can see by that background and that conjunction of interest that we're in for a very interesting talk. Professor Segata.
So thank you, Jerry, and thank you for attending this meeting. Good afternoon, everyone. I need to start my computer. I'm glad to return to Brown University once again, and I would like to thank Patsy Lewis, the director of the CLEX, and Catherine Goldman, the manager, who made this meeting possible. Between 2020 and 21, I conduct some research that analyzed the social impacts of the pandemic among workers in the meat industry in southern Brazil. What drew my attention at the time was the high number of COVID-19 cases. However, the problems turned out to be broader than that. So what has become evident is that the meat processing chain is a catalyst for structural violence, inequalities, precarious, racialized, and speciesist work, and the intensive production of unhealthy ecologies that feed emerging pathogens. This strong arm of agribusiness, whose activities didn't stop even during the most critical moments of the pandemic, is actually the protagonist of a set of chronic destruction that exploits and sickens humans, animals, and environments at the same time. It was from this starting point that I began to ask myself, how does the way we have been eating feed the end of the world? To answer this question, I will present a syndemic and multi-species analysis of structural violence that connects social, environmental, and health crises. In the medical anthropology of Mary Singer and Barbara Hilkobauer, syndemics is the adverse synergistic interaction for two or more diseases or other health conditions promoted or facilitated by social and environmental conditions, while structural violence refers to the often hidden ways that structures of inequality, such as poverty, racism, and discrimination, negatively impact the lives and well-being being of affected populations. In addition, the multi-species analysis by anthropologists Eben Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich allow us to expand the idea of the affected population beyond humans. So, animals, microorganisms, plants, minerals, soil, and the atmosphere are included alongside humans, each with their legible biographies and political protagonism. I began by describing the relationship between meat consumption and the pandemic from two very different contexts. The possible origin of the virus in Chinese wet markets and the circulation and contamination of the virus in the slaughterhouses of southern Brazil. My purpose is to show how the overvaluation of exotic narratives concerning the consumption of wild animals obliterates the way in which agro-industrial capitalism operates the machinery of sickness and destruction. In the second part of my presentation, I address how unhealthy ecologies and the embodiment of precarization are shaped by environmental and labor deregulation and the simplification of life, which form the lucrative basis of agribusiness. My purpose is to show how global markets drive the industrialization and standardization of fresh foods, which are obtained from the combination of genetic modifications that make animals and environments vulnerable, and the repetitive movements that destroy the bodies of human workers on production lines. In addition, I explain how agribusiness reproduces in new configurations the historic and devastating social, sanitary, and environmental conditions that have affected Brazil since colonial times. And I end this talk by suggesting that rather than declaring war on pathogens, what we need is policies of joint care for humans, animals, and the environment. My argument is that the pandemic is a multiple, unequal event that surpasses pathogen-centric global narratives. Socioeconomic, cultural, political, and environmental distinctions stress the homogeneity of the risk, disease, and care. The point is that viruses alone do not make a pandemic. A more or less contingent entanglement establish favorable conditions for events like this to take shape and gain intensity. Agri-food production and distribution chain on a global scale form a prominent example of this. So I will start presenting something beyond bat soups and chicken wings. I'm sure all of you remember early in 2020 when an outbreak of a new species of pneumonia began to spread rapidly from the city of Wuhan in central China. I was here, I remember, yeah. At the time, an original narrative emerged, shaping an imagination of the pandemic. The infection was alleged to have started with the consumption of the meat of some wild animal sold in the city's wet markets. Seafood, snakes, civets, pangolins, all were suspect of enabling the virus to spill over from the wild to humans. The speculation gained many versions, but it was the image of a bat soup as the original source of the pandemic that gained the world's attention. However, while the attention of certain global health technocrats was focused on the exotic eating habits that largely fueled their moral narratives about health risks and civility, another story involving the pandemic and meat consumption was gaining ground in public opinion. Plants in the global meat processing industry were linked to numerous outbreaks of contamination by the novel coronavirus in countries like the United States, Germany, and Brazil. In the state of Rio Grande do Sul, where I coordinate the research, the official numbers were 7,693 confirmed cases of COVID-19 among workers in the meat packing sector in one pandemic year between March 2020 and March 2021. In Jan 2020, this number came to represent 32% of the cases in the entire states. That is, 1/3 of the contingent of those infected. This clearly suggests that working with meat accounted for a large part of the internalization of the disease in the state at the onset of the pandemic. Brazil cannot stop. This is a jargon widely repeated by President Jair Bolsonaro, was faithfully followed by the sector, but this led to serious consequences. Let me bring an example. I work 3 days with a fever of over 38 degrees. It was COVID. That is what Nelson told me in a WhatsApp message. I couldn't stop. If person in charge discovered someone was sick, he'd send them home. But there are protocols, right? But when you are at home, the money doesn't come in. The company discounts everything. So we had to go work even knowing the danger. It was the only one sick. I wasn't the only one sick. People disguise it, you know. We took medicine to lower the fever and cheat the temperature checkers. You have to keep hustling. Nelson is a meat packer. He works in the demorning line of a meat processing plant in one of many small towns in the interior of southern Brazil that runs the operation of a corporation that is headquartered here in the United States. We talked a few times remotely, and even though his was considered a case of recovery, the infection that hit him 6 months before we chatting was still showing its strength. I still feel a pain in my chest, some suffocation, something awful, but now I'm used to it. According to him, many people were infected and were still suffering from persistent symptoms. I have some workmates who become very sick. Lots of people come from abroad and work seasonally. They share a house and all sleep together, sort of huddled together. Everyone got COVID, and some are still bothered by shortness of breath, poor sleep, and strong headaches. This thing hit us hard. 2020 was very hard. Indeed, 2020 was very busy. It was a record year for the meat industry in Brazil. Including poultry, pork, and beef cattle, the country increased exports by approximately 10%, raising the country to second position in the world ranking of meat production. All of this was thanks to increase the individual work goals, overtime, and fever breaks, including restrictions on toilet use, which meant Nelson and other workers didn't drink water so they would not feel like peeing. But there are more reasons why 2020 was a hard year. Having been off the world hunger map for at least 2 decades, Brazil was once again haunted by food insecurity, which the world came to know about through images of people fighting over bones. This scenario further aggravated the situation of vulnerability during the pandemic due to malnutrition. It turns out that, in contrast to the increase in production and export rates exalted by agribusiness, economic research has shown how a staggering increase in the price of the basic food basket, particularly beef, took food away from Brazilian plates during the pandemic. Currently, 33 million people are hungry in Brazil. Such ambivalence shows that the vocation of agribusiness isn't to produce food on a democratic scale, but rather to intensively produce money and sickness. Nelson and so many thousands of workers in this sector are subject to dying of viruses and hunger while producing food to feed the stock markets and the fortunes of the lords of the agro-industrial empire. Furthermore, while the global public opinion was focused on exotic practices, the unhealthy mainstream meat corporations maintained their business as usual. I say this because it's necessary to emphasize that food preferences in China go way beyond civets, pangolins, or bat soups. The country is one of the biggest importers of beef produced in Brazil. The commercial volume is so robust that it accounted for more than 1/4 of the country's beef production and more than half the pork production in 2020. Due to the outbreak in Wuhan, Brazilian politicians felt free to blame China for the origin of the pandemic. They demanded responsibility and raised suspicions of conspiracy. Meanwhile, a few batches of chicken wings contaminated with the virus, combined with xenophobia and diplomatic malpractices, have shown that there are even more toxic problems in these global markets. Amid the disputes over the location of the virus, whether it was deposited on the packaging or directly on surface of the chicken, the World Health Organization published a note saying that the meat was safe to eat. However, the organization didn't comment on the exponential increase in COVID contamination in meat processing plants, which were publicly known for their precarious and insanitary conditions. In other words, the World Health Organization came out in defense of chicken meat, but not the chicken meat workers, demonstrating that biosecurity policies protect commodities much more than people, animals, or the environment. In addition, the World Health Organization has guides to use of nomenclatures for viruses and infections coded with letters and numbers without geographical identification, as was the case of the Spanish flu, Nile fever, or Zika virus. At issue has been an attempt to mitigate the stigmatization and persecution of populations, such as those that accommodate labels like Chinese virus in the case of COVID. Robbie Wallace, who is interested in understanding the geographical origin of certain virus strains, questioned this measure, while acknowledging the potential stigmatization. His criticism suggests that this is an attempt to disrupt epidemiological research through mapping the evolution and diffusion of pathogens to calm the moods of countries that benefit from large agribusiness corporations and that fund the World Health Organization. Geography cannot be reduced to a political spatial demarcation. It involves the study of dynamics of occupation and appropriation of environments. There is robust evidence of an exponential emergence of pathogens in rapidly changing geographies, such as those harboring emerging large cities, monoculture crops, and livestock farming. According to Wallace, the geographical identification of the origin of a virus and its infections is a way of holding governments, nations, and corporations responsible when their actions favor the appearance of such viruses. Moreover, the author affirms a finer taxonomy would be even more preferable. Once the production plants where the outbreaks originate are identified, we could name the virus strains according to their corporate origins. Thus, instead of Gamma, Delta, or Omicron, it could be more appropriate to name the variant JBS, Tyson and Foods, Cargill, Smithfield, and so on. The point is that if meat processing plants cannot be considered all that safe for their human workers, the animals, or even the environment, it is evident that the massive exposure of Chinese wet markets as responsible for the emergence of the virus is merely a tactic to divert attention from the responsibilities of the large-scale meat industry. Second point. Passando a boiada. Literally setting the cattle loose, or figuratively pushing through further deregulation. Well, the recording of a meeting that brought together the ministers of the federal government in May 2020 exposed the intricacies of the destructive political arrangement we are living in Brazil. In one of the most scandalous scenes, the then Minister of Environment, Ricardo Salles, praised the fact that they faced an opportunity to pass the infra-legal reforms of deregulation and simplification that the whole world demands, while the press turned to its attention to the pandemic. I will repeat his words. So, to do this, we need to make an effort here while we are in this moment of tranquility in terms of press coverage, because they are only talking about COVID, and get on with passando a boiada and changing all the regulations and simplifying norms. From IFAM, from the Ministry of Agriculture, from the Ministry of Environment, from the Ministry of this, from the Ministry of that. Now, it's time to join forces to push through simplification. It's regulation that we need in all aspects. As I have showed, the meat processing industry in southern Brazil is one of the sectors where the boiada está passando. Accidents and injuries, psychiatric disorders, contamination by chemical substances, illness caused by immune vulnerability, and the exploitation of labor force of migrants and indigenous people have provided strong evidence of the risks involved in this activity. Also, the high rate of COVID among its workers showed how much the meat chain favors the circulation of, exposure to, and contamination by the virus. However, the emergence of new pathogens comes into play in this set, considering the toxic effects of agribusiness on local ecologies in global ecosystems, which includes deforestation for crops and pastures, reduced biodiversity, water pollution, and the emission of the more than 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year into the atmosphere. As I told you, Rob Wallace's body of work on agribusiness underlines how significantly the industry is responsible for generating environments favorable to scale production of new pathogens and for removing immunological obstacles that could delay the transmission of a new disease because of the transformation of animals into raw material based on genetic monocultures. In this industrial model, for example, pigs need to grow evenly so they can be exploited as labor agroindustrial capitalism. This is about standardization in the food industry. That is, there can be no discrepancy between the amounts of fat and muscle because product uniformity is a quality factor. However, the production lines of meat processing plants also require standardization. The carcasses must be of adequate size and weight to circulate on conveyor belts and hooks, requiring the same movements and time intervals when handled by human workers. Herds are genetically modified and exposed to same controlled environmental conditions on farms, using the same food compounds for their nutrition. Thus, they can become components that are not only perfectly adapted to industrial lines, but also to the capitalist demands of commodity standardization and the preference of those who consume their bodies converted into meat. It is the simplification of life implied in the emerging rationality synthesized in the advertising slogan of Brazilian media: agro is tech, agri is pop, agri is everything. It promises to feed an increasingly populous and hungry world, when in truth it expands the profit scales of capitalism with crops optimized by a combination of genetic enhancement and precarious human and animal labor. In Precarious, anthropologist Alex Blanchett analyzes how the kill lines of meatpacking plants in southern United States shape the bodies of Latino migrants through painful and repetitive work. Workers become specialized to deal with certain parts of pig carcass, which begins to shape traumas that manifest themselves in their bodies. In other words, humans, pigs, and capitalism merge along the queue lines, as human workers thus embody the commercial anatomy. They need to do repetitive movements, so they embody the commercial anatomy of pigs and industrial capitalism through the desirable repetitive motions that favor the standard design of the cut of the meat of its production lines. Furthermore, the author shows us how the medical departments that serve meat processing plants leverage human and swine work through the animalization of blood. Medical examinations that identify occupational trauma also classify human workers' bodies into tendons and muscles that help the industry make decisions concerning the skills that combine the strengths of human and pig physicalities in the queue and cutting lines. In his words, this process marks a situation where decades of effort to wring more veil from porcine bodies are now doubling back to remake how the human body is marshaled as an industrial site of new money. But it's not just humans who are poorly positioned in their aptitudes that get in the way of the scale production process. As I told you, misaligned pigs are a problem for meat processing plants. It is akin to wanting to assemble an SUV in a compact car production plant. Its housing doesn't fit on the tracks, and its assembly is unfeasible. This is the reason that the standardization of animals begins with genes. Currently, just 3 breeds of pigs and 2 genetic matrices of chicken account for more than 90% of world's consumption of these types of meat. It turns out that this type of homogenization exposes entire herds to potential mass contamination, requiring the administration of high doses of antibiotics, so their already short lifespans endure until slaughter, and they do not succumb to disease beforehand. Often, the job of veterinarians in this sector is reduced to respond to ambivalent demand to keep animals alive long enough to gain the weight that guarantees a profitable death. But the digestive system of these animals, especially pigs, doesn't fully metabolize the complex of drugs and supplements they consume, causing part of these pharmacological residues to be eliminated in their feces and urine. An example also discussed in Blanchet's ethnography is illustrative and corresponds to the Brazilian reality. Ponds around confined farming receive manure from pigs. They also receive high doses of antibiotics and other substances not processed by the pig's digestive system. The strong sun causes the liquid part formed of manure and urine to evaporate, carrying with it the residual drug particles. When it rains, they reach human and other animal population in this region and settle directly inside their bodies by crossing the porous borders of the skin. The dry part of the manure left in the ponds turns into dust that scatters on the wind and settles in the lungs of the workers and the neighbors of these corporations when they breathe. The Brazilian case is even more worrying, since some pig farms are positioned over the ponds, causing the manure that falls into the water to be eaten by fish raising in confinement, reusing the same feed twice to optimize inputs and amplify profits. Shortly, the meat industry intersects racism and speciesism. Some humans, especially black people and immigrants, and some animals are both precarious workers, exploited by agri-food capitalism. They share situations of intense exploration and suffering. Humans have to deal with waste, viscera, and production lines that involve very low temperatures and accidents with sharp objects. In turn, animals like pigs work for this corporation on a full-time basis, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Pigs don't rest. They need to intensively eat the feed that is positioned in the feeders in front of them and yield muscle and fat in the shortest time possible to be recognized as employees of the month. The pig's surplus value is bacon. In addition, many of the human workers at the meatpacking plants in Rio Grande do Sul who were infected by the novel coronavirus are also young black people, migrants from Venezuela, Haiti, and Senegal. Others are indigenous people who move from their territories already destroyed by the expansion of agribusiness to find work in these corporations under extremely precarious conditions. This situation maintains certain parallels with the colonial times and regimes of slavery. Southern Brazil has a long history with the meat industry. The state of Rio Grande do Sul was a powerful international pole of the beef jerky industry in the 19th century, sustained by slave labor. Numerous workers based on archival research provide evidence that not only did slavery exist, but that it was one of the cruelest forms in Brazil, since the wounds on the slaves' bodies resulting from constant punishment were exposed to the salt used to dry the meat, producing continuous torture while they worked. Moreover, medical records of that period show that the huge pieces of salted meat also intensified the precarious working condition, causing serious back problems. Or, in the words of the chroniclers, a good side of jerk should be like a prison. In addition, environmental degradation was rife, described as rivers of blood and viscera and clouds of putridness, in reference to the untreated waste of this industry, to say nothing of the cholera that contaminated slaves who worked barefoot in dirty water, tuberculosis that spread in their damp, collective dormitories, and the contamination with bubonic plague resulting from contact with contaminated rats that traveled on the trains that transported the cattle jerky and tanned leather between Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. In summary, in the past and present, exploitation, precarious, racialized, and speciesist work, the production of unhealthy ecologies and pandemics seem to be inordinately associated with the meat processing industry. So, to conclude, feeding the end of the world. The intersection of agribusiness-based food systems, health, and global ecological crisis requires the adoption of a multi-species approach. The destructive exploitation of humans, animals, and environments is not a phenomenon separated from the broader process of structural violence. It materializes in the historical degradation of environments through extractivism and the transformation of nature into commodities, and the nutrition model of carnism, which increasingly demands the creation and slaughter of animals on a scale that guarantees the supply of international markets eager for protein consumption. Both cases rely on infrastructure based on degrading work and exposure to numerous forms of contamination, which is why we must think less about a war on pathogens and more about forms of coexistence and joint care policies for humans, animals, and environments. Viruses do not appear alone. They are the result of centuries of planetary destruction and exploitation. Social, environmental, and health crises are not isolated events, and the COVID-19 is yet another evident manifestation. The pandemic took shape and gained intensity within the harmful combination of political and corporate agents, the dismantling of social policies, and historical relations of power and inequalities that act with the virus in the creation of environments of risk and vulnerability. So, the situation in the meat industry in southern Brazil during the pandemic echoes and materialize what Ulrich Brand and Marcus Wissen call the imperial mode of living, The idea that everyday life in the capitalism centuries is essentially made possible by shaping social relations and society-nature relations elsewhere, i.e., by means of unlimited access to labor power, natural resources, and thanks. We are a kind of thanks there. Likewise, for the modern ideals of freedom and autonomy exercised at the center of the exploitation of material research in another place. When Nelson told us that he worked with a fever, sick with COVID, in a meat processing plant in a country that broke export records in the same year it was released on the World Hunger Mapper, there can be no doubt. We are the other place. The fact is that if yesterday it was the devastating process of colonization and expropriation that raised the local population and natural landscapes, today it is genetic manipulation technologies that convert the poorest countries into large, profitable plantations of transgenic crops and confined animal farming. Together with large, chaotic metropolis, industrial complexes, they also form cuts and wounds that expose us to high degrees of risk and vulnerability. In broader terms, these unequal burdens on segregated bodies in the midst of precarious ecologies highlight the role of racial capitalism that drives migrants, black and indigenous people to disproportionate degrees of porous contact with potentially contaminating substances and situations. It is the material form of structural violence that silently intersects and embody the Anthropocene and its racial, class, and species hierarchies. Shortly, the end of the world comes first for us living on the peripheries. For Pierre Charbonnier, the Anthropocene reveals a material history of freedom based on the achievement of emancipation through the accumulation of energy and material sources that result from the conversion of nature into an exploited resource. As Charbonnier sums up, freedom is fossil fuel. In addition, I would say freedom is also meat, soybean, and precarious work. Every end of the world means exploration. Quoting the indigenous activist Ailton Krenak, if agri is tech, agri is pop, agri is everything, then this calamity that we are experiencing on the planet today can present its bill to agri. I agree, and I highlight we must question more incisively the role of the agri in the cultivation and intensive breeding of disease and degradation. Agribusiness promises to feed a hungry planet, but it doesn't. Agribusiness fuels the end of the world. Thank you. Wow.
So, that was a most sobering and truly interdisciplinary. Is this on? Do you need it on? Okay. Yeah? Yes, okay. So thank you for a most sobering, truly interdisciplinary, very thought-provoking presentation. I have innumerable questions, which I will not put forward. Maybe I'll just do one to get the conversation started. But I can't resist at least a couple of observations, which are not questions. And one of them is, to me, how your work is introducing a very different history of the plantation and of racial capitalism and of slavery, because we associate it with the usual agricultural crops. One of the things about Brazil that's always been interesting to me is that it introduces the notion of the royal slaves who were mine workers, so slavery in mining, and also the royal slaves who were fisher people, so royal slaves who were in fishing. But this one, slavery and the meat industry, introduces an entirely, and the meat industry as plantation, so the salt jerky and the processing of it as another plantation environment. So for some people who call it the plantationocene and not just the Anthropocene, I think that your work is a very rich and disturbing addition or contribution to histories of the plantation and histories of slavery. Secondly, observation, I was struck by the nature of an approach which puts together everything that you're putting together, which is nature, or we could say flora and fauna and the earth features, with these problems of culture, socialness, and politics. And the other place where I've seen that done, and I hear a lot of resonances, is in the work. Well, you mentioned Ailton Crack, but others who maybe don't write books about it, but who definitely speak about it, talk it, and live it, is some of the people who live in quilombos in Brazil. And so I come to call their thinking quilombola ideas or quilombola philosophy. But I'm struck with that combination. Their analysis is not just power and knowledge nexus, but power, knowledge, culture, land, water, humans and non-humans, beings, and so the kinds of knowledge and power relations that those create, those ideas to me seem to resonate, greatly with what you were saying. And my final observation is I was carried back to childhood reading when my mother handed me, I think it was Sinclair Lewis. It was an early novelist on the meatpacking industry, and I was just horrified as like an 11 or 12-year-old. And then a bit later, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, that kind of sounding the bell of emergency, the alarm bell. And then finally, less studied on this side, but should be more studied, is the work of Vandana Shiva on monoculture, the Indian bioscientist who works with women and agriculture, and her work on monoculture and the agro industry. So I just wanted to say how many resonances came up to me when you were giving your talk. But the question I'd like to ask you, which may take you a little bit far away, but I'm sure other questions will bring us back, is in your mind and in your work and through through your research and your work on the ground, is there a way that you could offer a different notion of food security? Because this is obviously vaunted as capitalism's answer to the questions of food security or the questions of everyone having enough to eat. What's a different definition that you have seen or you are coming to about what food security for Brazil first and then for the planet might mean? What is a different reading of food security?
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for the questions and the comments. Well, firstly, I try to describe a new history, not a new history, but a new element to think about the history of slavery in Brazil. Yeah, as you told me, slavery is associated to mining and to sugar plants and 19th century. Yeah, but it's important to think in mind, to have in mind that the beef jerky industry in southern Brazil is totally based on slave labor too, and almost all time this slavery was silently to put in silence with white narratives, because white narratives explores to highlight the history of the sugar industry or the good things in the southern Brazil, but not about the slavery or not about the infrastructure of this richest industry in 19th century. So my point in this case is to, I don't know, is to add at the discussions of the Anthropocene and other things, slavery or a precarious labor history too, because isn't Anthropocene with no slavery work or with no precarious work? Né? Where is the Anthropocene is the slavery or precarious labor too? So I like the way that Malcolm Ferdinand is a researcher from Martinique in the Caribbean Ecologies, talking about this. The end of the world starts with the caravels. Start with the
at least the end of that world.
yeah. So this is a kind of black narrative about the Anthropocene. It's a good way to think about this, because only almost all the narratives about the end of the world, about the ecology, especially the ecology in general terms, is a white narrative about the ecology. It's a white narrative about the Anthropocene and other things. So, like you told me, it's really good to think about from indigenous thought, like Ailton Krenak and other things, but from Quilombo thinkers and to stress these narratives. And about food security, yeah, my point is that it's not the problem to eat meat, beef and other things. The problem is the large scales. And I think we need to think about food security in small circuits and small productions and neighborhood productions of vegetables and meat and other things, and not about the large scales. But industrial food or fresh foods is the same problem when you put in large scales, because Seth Holmes is a researcher, American researcher that wrote about the fresh foods, especially the strawberries and other fresh fruits sold in the United States. Yeah. So organic fresh foods, sometimes sold in Whole Foods and other spaces, but based in precarious labor from migrants from Mexico and other countries. Because fresh food, when you eat fresh food, thinking about your well-being and other things, if you need to eat in a few days, because fresh foods estragam. I'm sorry.
Get spoiled easily.
Yeah. So we need a lot of precarious labor to produce this large-scale fresh foods in a few time, because of the chain and other things. So my point is thinking about food security, trying to increase local markets, local chains, and not global chains, because I don't know how to say, but a strawberry don't green up every time in every year.
It's seasonal.
It's seasonal, yeah. So we need to think about these fruits and meat. It's not like an iPhone or a computer. You can produce the same thing every time, and everywhere. So we need to think about the the small circuits.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's,
And a kind of a disaggregation, if I understand you, between agriculture and industry. We've put them together now,
Yeah.
agro-industry,
yeah,
but maybe to think about them a little bit less closely
Yes.
tied, and not the same system for
Correct,
producing, as
correct.
you said, your iPad
yeah.
and your strawberries.
Yeah, and increase local sensitivities because people are eating the same thing in all of world. So and the local foods. Where is the local foods? So in the memory, but not in the table. Yeah. So
Okay. Other questions or comments?
You mentioned in Nelson's statement or text with you that there were folks who were immigrants living in these conditions that caused them to share COVID. Where are those immigrants from in Brazil?
I don't know the totally in Brazil, but it's a good question, Kate, because in only in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, we have 40,000 workers in the meat processing industry. And counting migrants and indigenous people, we have 24% of this account. So 1/4 of the workers are migrants or indigenous. In one of the plant where I did my field work, 500 indigenous were working there. Yes, in one plant, only in one plant, and some regions of Rio Grande do Sul, sometimes about 50% of the workers are from Haiti. So it depends the parts, but in totally 1/4 of the workers in this sector, only in this sector, are migrants. So, and especially, I don't know how to say, but it's like to materialize an apartheid, because in the floor, in contact with viscera and sharp instruments and other things, you can see black people, and in the high floor, veterinaries and other managers and are white people. So you can see this hierarchy in the meat processing so cruelly.
Very racialized production system.
Very racialized system. Yes, and I don't know, but how to say, but in Brazil, they create a kind of public policy to welcoming migrants, especially non-documented migrants. So these people cannot work in normal conditions because they don't have documents. So it's a public policy to welcoming them. But in concrete situations, it's not welcoming. It's a way to disguise the labor rights. So these people earn so less salaries than other documented people in same situation. So because this is a precarious, and this is the kind of simplification that Ricardo Salles said we need simplification. So simplification of rights too. So this, especially migrants, don't have rights, labor rights and other things. And this is a kind of a good thing because they are welcome. We have public policies to put them into the industry and gain some money. But not. It's a so cruel form of precarization.
Yeah, I'm struck again by the interdisciplinarity of your work, because you are pushing us to draw connections between labor policies, immigration policies, food policies and environmental policies, just, by the approach that you take and the material that you draw into the body of evidence, let's put it that way. So it's really very important work. Other questions or observations? You look like you have one, but you're feeling shy about it.
Yeah, so
It can be an observation or a question, either way.
I have a question. So considering that the fish market has to be much larger than the meat industry, I was wondering whether you know if some of these lessons in terms of the health risks and the labor exploitation from the meat industry can also be applied to the fish industry.
yeah. Thank you for the question. I know something about the fish industry, yeah, but it's a point that I know. It's the use of the pounds of the manure of the pigs to feed the fishes in intensive production. But we have a lot of examples of the fish production, especially salmon in the Chile coast. This salmon is not a kind of animal because sometimes they can swim, they can live from out of the I don't know how to say das jaulas. The cages, yeah, they can live then because they only feed to grown up and only this is it's not a kind of fish, it's a other thing, and sometimes they need to put a kind of artificial color because this salmon don't have color, so it's a so precarious situation. But now I know a researcher in Brazil working on fish production, not to eat the fish, but to use in the cosmetic industry. So especially in Pará state is an Amazonian region, the creation of a kind of fish only to use to fix I don't know the cosmetics in your face. So, but I don't know. I don't have any details, but it's an increase, including this kind of advertising. Agri is tech, agri is pop, agri is everything. Is an advertising in Brazil include a lot of things. Include bread, include fruits, include cereals, include meat, and now include fish production. So fish is agri, fish is tech, you know. So it's a new way to think about the meat production in Brazil, the fish production. So, but it's a really interesting research and field. I don't know more about that, but it's a good way to think about.
If I could add to that, this takes us precisely up to the northeast part of Brazil, where the fishing quilombos that I mentioned, the maroon communities, they, quilombo equals maroon community. The ones that live by fishing and along rivers or at the seacoast are very much concerned about this problem. Part of their critique is of agro, they call it agro-industry and agrotoxics, or so the things that are polluting their production of seafood and fish. So if you take as an analogy, it's very important for them to have the mangrove, because that's where a lot of fish lay their eggs, that's where the shellfish come and reproduce. And so they've been waging quite a struggle to explain, on the one hand, that their work, small scale, adds so much of the national production of healthy protein, as they say. but it's small scale. It's women and men. It's very small scale. It's very local. It's seasonal. And so they make all of these critiques. And one of the things that they talk about is the difference, for example, between their shrimp,
Yes.
which are, naturally
So
caught
toxic
around the mangrove,
industry.
and the industry. They call them, and I love this expression, mariscos em cativeiro.
Yes.
So it's captive or imprisoned shellfish, which are on these kind of industrial farms. They actually stake off positions in the sea and say, you can't come there. This belongs to our agro-industrial seafood producing fish farm. So there are really a lot of analogies, both in the problem and I think in the solutions that people who are pushing back against this have to offer. So you're on a good trail there if you wanted to look it up and to think about those two kinds of two sets of relationships and ideas about nature and human beings and the production of food.
Yeah. So yes, and after all, I think it's a good when I say something about a multi-species analysis, because some humans are some animals and some plants are exploited as a precarious labor, a research and other things, but is not considered so humans are so animals like others. So this is the point. So it's a combination of exploitation from humans, animals, and other beings.
It introduces a different way of thinking about the world too. You can't just think about humans. You also have to think about the plants. The fishing quilombo is good for that example. The mangroves, as you know, are kind of trees that grow up in the seawater. You've got the animals that live there. You've got the humans who fish. And then you've got the invading agro-marine capitalism that,
Yes.
that is probably going to produce another set of illnesses or viruses here that we don't even, that we don't even know about. Because by your argument, that's where it happens. The conjunction that leads to the production of these things happens in that multi-species space.
Yes. And almost all times, public opinion claim against the exotic relations with some animals or seafoods or other ways to consumption. So it's criminalize the local sensibilities to eat. So this is a point. Yeah.
Any more questions? I think we're close to our time, right, Kate? Yes? No? Okay. Well then, join me in thanking Professor Segata for a most illuminating and thought-provoking discussion. Are you writing a book on this, or have you written your book on this? You finish it. Good. We'll look for it. We'll look for it. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.